It wasn't that there wasn't just a word of outrage about the 40,000 Iranians that were slaughtered. There was criticism of the United States for trying to hurt, disarm, isolate, bankrupt the government that killed the 40,000. But not a word from our American left. All they had contempt for was one tiny country of 10.5 million. So if you want to know what an anti-Semite is, it's selective outrage and hypocrisy.
For the last 2.5 years, we've heard the same accusations repeated over and over again. Israel is genocidal. Israel is colonial. Israel is uniquely evil. Israel is the greatest threat to peace. But what if the real story isn't what people say about Israel? What if the real story is what they don't say about everyone else? Because that's exactly what Victor Davis Hanson exposes in this clip. And honestly, this may be one of the most powerful defenses of Israel I've ever heard since October 7th. Not because he ignores civilian suffering, not because he excuses war, but because he asks a question that almost nobody wants to answer. Why is Israel held to standards that no other country on earth is held to? When Hamas massacred 1,200 Israelis and kidnapped hundreds of hostages, what exactly was Israel supposed to do? What would America do? What would Britain do? What would France do? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, why do the same people who obsess over Israel suddenly go silent when atrocities are committed by Iran, Turkey, Syria, Qatar's allies, Hamas, Hezbollah, or countless other regions? Whether you agree with Victor Davis Hanson or not, I challenge you to listen carefully to the argument he's making, because he's not talking about Israel. He's talking about hypocrisy. And once you see it, it's very hard to unsee it. Let's watch.
One of the best indicators of anti-Semitism is selectivity, selective outrage. What do I mean by that? We talked about Israel after October 7th. Remember that 1,200 Israelis were butchered, raped, mutilated in medieval fashion. Israel did not go into Gaza on the ground right away. For 3 weeks, not until October 27th, did it enter Gaza. And what was it supposed to do? Go to the UN, ask China and Russia on the Security Council? China has 1 million people of Uyghurs in camps. Russia is waging a genocidal war in Ukraine, and ask them to be fair? Go to the NATO or EU and ask the Spanish premier, Mr. Sanchez, to negotiate with Hamas? What were they supposed to do? What were they supposed to reply to when Hamas would not give up the perpetrators, would not give up the 251 hostages, descended into a labyrinth of tunnels, and the entries and exits were beneath churches, mosques, and schools? What were they to do? What would anybody do? What would the United States do? The United States is 34 times larger than Israel is. 34 times larger. So what would we do? Well, if 6,000 Hamas people went into Israel, what would happen if 200,000 people came into the United States across the border, let's say from Sinaloa, the cartels? Instead of they butchered 1,200, but let's say in American terms, 34 times larger, they butchered 40,000 Americans. That would be a fair comparison. And then they took back 8,000, not 251, but 34 times, given our larger size, back to Mexico. What would we do? What would we do? Would we say, would you please, can we negotiate with El Chapo and the cartel people in Geneva? Can we ask our friends in the UN to criticize them? Or would we hear almost immediately that we had it coming because of the Mexican War or Yankee Go Home? We probably hear that. And don't think that that is an exaggeration. In 1917, Pancho Villa crossed the border, went into Colombia and New Mexico, and took over the town and killed 17 Americans. What did the United States do? We put 100,000 people on the border, and left-wing President Wilson sent John Pershing into Mexico to find him. Futile. And do you think that people were outraged that Pancho Villa did that? No. President Obrador, the former president of Mexico, just 2 years ago said that he thought it was a wonderful thing what Pancho Villa did by invading the United States and killing Americans. He said it was a blow to you imperialism. It's like, you can imagine what we would do. We would bomb, and we would tell people in Sinaloa, please separate yourself from the cartel members. Please get out of the hospitals and the schools and the churches where their entry or exits are beneath them. And you can imagine the outrage. Are we worried about illegal occupations? I don't think so. Worldwide, Turkey is still occupying via the Turkish population Cyprus, northern Cyprus. Are we worried about ethnic cleansing? Turkey in 1917 to 1921 ethnically cleansed 1.2 million Armenians. We've given Turkey an aggregate of about $500 million in direct aid and military sales. Are we worried that they threaten to go into Cyprus? They threaten Athens all the time. They threaten Israel. Why do we stay allies with them? Recently, Azerbaijan, a Turkic-speaking people, the country of Azerbaijan, went into the Nagorno corridor, and they ethnically cleansed 120,000 Armenians. Some of them had been there since medieval times. What was weird about it was it almost to the day was simultaneously to October 7th. Did Mahmoud Khalil and the Colombian protesters say, we want a moment of silence because our Turkish Muslim friends have gone into another country and ethnically cleansed 120,000 people? No, we didn't hear a word. If you want a more direct comparison, after the 67 war and the wars that followed, the Arab nations ethnically cleansed 900,000 Jews from Egypt, from the Gulf states, from Jordan, from Syria, from Iraq. There's a few, maybe 20,000 in other Muslim countries, but there's almost none in the Arab world today. They were all ethnically cleansed. Did Israel do that? Well, when Israel was formed in 1948, there was about 800,000 Arabs that fled. 150,000 stayed in Israel. Today, that population is increased 14 times greater. There are 2.1 million Arab citizens of Israel, and yet Israel is called an ethnic cleanser and a police state when the Arab world surrounding it ethnically cleansed almost 1 million Jews. Sometimes the Europeans are very angry. The French have been very vocal. Do we remember what France did in Chad for almost 50 years? Currently, the people of Chad are rediscovering their national identity, and they're very anti-French. We helped the French. We gave them logistical support, reconnaissance, etc., logistics to go in and stop Islamicists in Chad. But when they were at the early part of the 20th century, around 1917, they massacred 400 Islamic scholars. They call it the Cuckoo Massacre. That's for blow or cut. And they didn't just massacre them. The French beheaded 400 Islamic scholars. Does anybody talk about that today? No, almost none. Nobody talks about it. So what I'm getting at is selectivity. Now, Miss Ilhan Omar, our representative, has been very critical. She's called Israel an illegitimate entity. She has a map where it doesn't even appear in her office. She said it's the Benjamin's baby about Netanyahu and his supposed moneyed interest that influenced the United States. Her family, her father was a colonel in Siad Barre's Marxist dictatorship in Somalia. He waged a genocidal campaign against an entire tribe of Somalis. He may have killed 150 to 200,000 people, ethnically cleansed them. And most of the Somalis who fled as supporters of Barre's Marxist dictatorship and who had an alliance with the United States. So they fled to the West. So we don't know the exact numbers, but there's a sizable percentage of the Somali community in the United States that were elites, as was Ilhan Omar's family, and directly involved with that illegitimate dictatorial Marxist government that waged ethnic cleansing. Let people who are without sin throw the first stone. Zoran Mondami is very critical of Israel. He can't seem to have an appointee that doesn't have an anti-Semitic past. He talks about interlopers, and his supporters say that Israel is a settler colonial power. There's a 3,500-year continuum of Jews in the Holy Land of Israel. It's not true of Indians in Uganda. Mondami's family came as, I guess he would use the term settler colonialist, into Uganda. They make up 1% of the Ugandan population. That would be, I guess he would call that the 1%ers or the wealthy foreigners. 1% of Uganda's present population, and they control or they're responsible for about 65% of their wealth. The wealthiest person in Uganda is a billionaire who of Indian descent. And I guess Miss Mandami or his father and mother didn't want to stay there anymore, so they came to America, and they're very critical of Israel as somehow illegitimate in the Middle East. It has a lot more historical claim to Israel than Indian immigrants do to basically running the economic structure of Uganda, there's no criticism of that. But my point is the hypocrisy is shocking. So when you want to know what an anti-Semite is, an anti-Semite is someone who fixates on Israel when there's a whole continuum, a whole spectrum of ethnic cleansing, massacring, killing. And I'll leave you with this final example. Why our campuses erupted over the Israeli incursion into Gaza, and no one said to the Israelis, we have a better plan for you to get back the hostages and punish the Hamas people. Nobody gave them, what were they supposed to do? Go and say to the Hamas people, would you please come and give yourself up and we won't go into Gaza? No, the people in Gaza cheered them on, even though there was a labyrinth of tunnels underneath their schools, mosques, and hospitals. So it was inevitable that civilians by intent were going to die, and a Hamas person admitted that, one of their leaders. But why this was all going on in our campus, our professors, our Middle Eastern studies programs were very, very angry. There were 40 mostly Muslim Iranians that were butchered by the current Iranian government. We weren't in there at all. We hadn't gone in there. We hadn't started bombing. Last summer was ancient history. We just hit a nuclear facility. But these people were butchered by their own country, and guess what? There was not a peep, not a word, not anything from the American left who's so critical of Israel. Not a word. Finally, it wasn't that there wasn't just a word of outrage about the 40,000 Iranians that were slaughtered. There was criticism of the United States for trying to hurt, disarm, isolate, bankrupt the government that killed the 40,000. But not a word from our American left. All they had contempt for was one tiny country of 10.5 million. So if you want to know what an anti-Semite is, it's selective outrage and hypocrisy.
You don't have to agree with every point Victor Davis Hanson makes, but you do have to answer the question, what was Israel supposed to do? That's the question almost nobody in the media ever asks. What was Israel supposed to do after October 7th? What would America do if 40,000 Americans were slaughtered and thousands more were dragged across the border? What would any sovereign nation do? Because the reality is that many critics never propose an alternative. They simply demand that Israel be the one country on earth that absorbs terror attacks without responding. And that's exactly why Victor's point about selective outrage matters so much. If your outrage only appears when Jews defend themselves, if your activism only activates when Israel is involved, if you ignore massacres, ethnic cleansing, dictatorships, terrorism, slavery, and oppression everywhere else, then people have a right to question whether your issue is really human rights or whether your issue is. That's the challenge Victor Davis Hanson leaves us with. Not whether Israel is perfect. No country is. But whether Israel is being judged by a standard that nobody else is expected to meet. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree with Victor Davis Hanson? Or do you think he's wrong? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. And if you value conversations that challenge narratives and ask difficult questions, subscribe to Stand Tall Israel and consider becoming a member, because these are the conversations most of the media refuses to have. If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this. You can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real. It is stored safely. It is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.